It was a quiet Thursday evening, one of those crisp late autumn nights when the world feels suspended between the fiery colors of fall and the cold promise of winter. I had just finished an endless shift at the clinic, one of those grueling days where every second feels heavier than the last. My body ached in ways I didn't even know were possible. But it was the mental exhaustion that weighed me down the most. Dealing with worried patients, endless paperwork, and the occasional coworker drama had drained every ounce of energy I had. Still, I drove home with a flicker of hope, the thought of a peaceful evening pulling me forward. To me, it wasn't just a place, it was a reprieve. I imagined the warmth of the living room, the faint hum of the heater kicking on, and the soft, familiar sound of Luna's paws patting across the hardwood floor. My mischievous Tabby always had a way of making everything better. Whether it was her dramatic meow demanding attention, or the way she curled up on my chest as if she were claiming me as her own. Alex, my partner, wouldn't be home tonight. He accepted an additional catering job for a private event. The holiday season always kept him occupied. He flourished in the whirlwind of menu planning and serving upscale clients. I didn't mind, as it meant I would have the house mostly to myself, myself and Ethan. Ethan was Alex's younger brother, and he had been living with us for a few months while attempting to find his way. At 22, Ethan stood at that peculiar crossroads in life where everything seemed both brimming with potential and completely aimless. He was quieter than Alex, more reserved. There was an unsettling quality about him, akin to a storm brewing just beneath the surface. As I pulled into the driveway, the sight of Ethan's car surprised me. It was parked at an odd angle, suggesting he had rushed home without a thought for tidiness. This was unusual for him, as he typically spent his evenings elsewhere. I didn't inquire. I assumed he needed the space to sort through his thoughts, and I respected his privacy. The house felt different as I stepped inside, dark, quiet, still. Normally, Luna would greet me, barreling toward me, meowing her demands for food or attention, but tonight there was nothing, just silence and the faintest sound of running water coming from upstairs. "Ethan," I called out softly, my voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. I set my bag down and hesitated for a moment before heading upstairs. The sound of the running water grew louder, and as I approached the bathroom, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the dark hallway, cutting through the stillness like a blade. I froze inside. Ethan stood at the sink, shirtless, his back turned to the door. His movements were hurried, almost frantic. The light above the mirror cast soft shadows over his back, highlighting the tension in his shoulders and the faint scars etched across his skin. For a moment, I couldn't move. Something about the scene felt too intimate, too vulnerable. Like I was intruding on a moment I wasn't meant to see. My brain, however, betrayed me, flashing with a thought I had no business entertaining. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered. Unwelcome and undeniable. Then it happened. The floorboard under my foot creaked. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine through the narrow gap in the door. His expression was a mix of alarm and embarrassment, his cheeks flushing a deep red that matched the tips of his ears. "Oh, sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. In one swift motion he lunged forward and grabbed the door pullin'. It shut with a soft thud from behind the barrier. I heard him mutter, "Didn't mean to." "Yes, sorry." I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Heat rushed to my face. A whirlwind of emotions surged within me, embarrassment, confusion, and an unnamed feeling that lingered just out of reach. My hand hovered over the door for a moment, then retreated, leaving me uncertain of my next move. For a few seconds I found myself staring at the closed door, my thoughts racing. What had just happened? Why had he been scrubbing at himself so vigorously? And why did I feel so unsettled by it all? I shook my head, attempting to shake off the strange tension that enveloped me, but it clung to me like the faint scent of soap drifting through the air. I lingered outside the bathroom door for another moment, unsure whether to retreat downstairs or stay and address what had just happened. My mind buzzed with a mix of confusion and concern. Ethan wasn't just acting embarrassed, something deeper was clearly bothering him, and yet it wasn't my place to push. Taking a deep breath, I knocked gently on the door. The sound almost tentative against the stillness of the hallway. "Ethan," I called softly, "look, it's okay. I didn't mean to barge in." There was no immediate response, just a faint. There was a shuffle of movement from the other side, and I waited, allowing him a moment to gather his thoughts. I then said, "You don't have to explain anything. Whatever's going on is your business. I'm not here to judge." After a long pause, his voice came through, quieter than usual. "It's nothing. I am fine. Sorry about that." I leaned my shoulder against the wall, striving to keep my tone calm and understanding. "Ethan, it's not a big deal. Everyone has awkward moments, it happens. You're entitled to your privacy. And you don't have to feel weird about it." Another pause, this one shorter. Then I heard a faint exhale, almost like a sigh of relief. "Thanks," he muttered. His voice just loud enough to reach me through the door. The tension in my chest eased slightly, and I allowed myself a small smile. "Good. Well, I'll let you finish up. I'm going to make tea if you want some later." I turned to head downstairs, figuring it was best to give him space. But before I could take more than a step, the door creaked open behind me. I stopped and glanced back, surprised to see Ethan standing there, his hair damp and messy, his shirt hastily thrown on. He paused. "Wait," he said quietly, his hand gripping the edge of the door. His eyes darted to mine, then quickly away, as if he lacked the courage to voice whatever was on his mind. I tilted my head, waiting patiently. "What is it?" I asked. He hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Finally, he stepped forward, his expression a mix of gratitude and vulnerability. "I just wanted to say thanks for not making this weird. You're the only one who doesn't make me feel like I'm screwing up." Everything felt heightened in that moment. His words caught me off guard, leaving me momentarily speechless. There was a rawness in his tone, an honesty that was rarely revealed. I offered him a reassuring smile. "You're not screwing up, Ethan. Everyone goes through stuff, it's part of life. You're figuring things out, and that's okay." For a brief moment, he stood there, his gaze shifting between me and the floor. Then, before I could say anything further, he took a step closer, leaning in. His movement was slow, almost hesitant, as if he were testing the waters. Before I could fully comprehend the moment, his lips grazed my cheek, a whisper of a touch that hung in the air, heavy with unexpressed feelings. He withdrew swiftly, a blush creeping across his face. "Sorry," he murmured, fidgeting with the back of his neck. "I just wanted to say thanks, for real." I blinked, taken aback by his gesture, my hand instinctively rising to the place where his lips had brushed my skin, but I halted midway. Instead, I offered him a soft smile, striving to convey my understanding. "Keep things light, it's okay, Ethan, really, I'm glad I could help." He nodded, his expression softening slightly, then turned and disappeared down the hallway without another word. I stood there for a moment, my thoughts swirling before finally heading downstairs. The warmth of the kitchen greeted me as I busied myself with the kettle, but my mind was far from settled. The gesture hadn't been romantic at all. D'n't have been. It was gratitude, pure and simple, but even as I repeated that thought to myself, I couldn't shake the strange mix of emotion stirred in my chest as the morning wore on. Ethan seemed to relax more and more. He even cracked a few jokes, one of which had me laughing so hard I almost spilled my coffee. It was a side of him I hadn't seen before, light, carefree, and unexpectedly charming. By the time Alex came home later that afternoon, the house felt different, lighter. Ethan greeted his brother with a casual wave, his demeanor as calm and collected as ever. But as I watched the two of them talk, I couldn't help but notice something subtle yet significant. Regarding Ethan, there was a subtle assurance in his demeanor, a tranquility that had previously eluded him. It felt as though he had released some unseen burden. And I couldn't shake the thought that our conversation the previous night might have influenced this transformation. Later that evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, a smile crept onto my face. My thoughts wandered back to Ethan's smile, his laughter, and the way he appeared more buoyant today. I reassured myself that it was merely relief. That I was pleased he seemed to be regaining his balance, yet deep down, I couldn't ignore the stirring of something more. Help but feel that something had shifted not just in him, but in me as well. That evening the house was quiet, almost still. Alex was away at another event, leaving Ethan and me alone. The absence of noise amplified the sense of space, making every movement and sound feel deliberate. I had just finished tidying up the kitchen when Ethan wandered in, his steps hesitant like he was carrying an unseen weight. He hovered near the doorway for a moment, then finally settled into a seat at the table, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a sleeve. I could feel it before he even said a word. A storm of emotions led up for far too long, teetering on the edge of spilling over. He sat there for a while, as if testing whether he could trust the silence between us, whether he could trust me, and then it began slowly. First fragments of thoughts, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet figured out. He spoke about Alex, about how growing up in his brother's shadow had shaped him in ways he didn't fully understand until recently. Alex, always composed, always successful, had been the benchmark Ethan felt he could never reach. It wasn't that Alex had done anything overly cruel, it was the unspoken comparison. The pressure to measure up to someone who seemed to have it all together. Ethan's voice faltered as he confessed how exhausting it had been to live under that shadow. He talked about how he had tried to emulate Alex, tried to chase his kind of success, but it had left him feeling hollow, like he was running a race that wasn't his to begin with. Every decision he made seemed to circle back to the same question: what? As Alex spoke, his words became increasingly laden with emotion. He confessed that being with us had served as both a sanctuary and a source of guilt. He felt like a burden, as if he were someone lost, unworthy of occupying space in our lives. The self-reproach in his voice was nearly overwhelming, compelling me to clutch the edge of the table to refrain from interjecting. What resonated most was not only the gravity of his message, but the raw vulnerability in his tone, as if he were stripping away layers of himself. He had concealed so much from everyone, unveiling fragments of himself that he didn't fully grasp. I listened closely, my heart constricting with each word. I hadn't understood the depth of this struggle, the weight he had borne in solitude. He expressed resentment towards Alex, towards himself, yet there was also a yearning. He sought to carve out his own path, to feel valued for his true self rather than for how adeptly he could imitate another. When he finally fell silent, the ensuing stillness was heavy, laden with all he had shared. Just revealed. His eyes, typically so shielded, were glistening with unshed tears as they connected with mine. I could sense the vulnerability there, the fear of judgment, the hope for understanding. Without a second thought, I moved closer, my hand reaching out to rest softly on his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt meaningful, like an acknowledgement. A promise that I had heard him, and wasn't going anywhere. The air between us shifted then, heavy with something unspoken yet undeniable. His gaze flickered to my hand, and then back to my face. And for a moment, we simply remained, heavy with the unspoken, and then it unfolded gradually, with a hint of uncertainty. Ethan leaned in, his movements deliberate and cautious, as if navigating uncharted territory. His lips met mine, gentle and tentative, as though seeking permission for a question he wasn't certain he could voice. I didn't retreat, instead. I allowed the moment to linger, letting the kiss evolve just a fraction more. It wasn't hurried or fervent, it was a softer exchange, imbued with the significance of all he had revealed. When we finally separated, the air between us was thick with unexpressed emotions. Us felt different, there was no awkwardness, no rush to fill the silence. Instead, there was an understanding. A connection that hadn't been there before. Ethan's eyes searched mine, and I could see the gratitude in them, the quiet relief of having been heard, of being seen not as Alex's brother. Not as someone who didn't measure up, but as himself. I sat there with him for a while longer, the unspoken promise between us lingering in the air. Whatever came next. It was clear that something had shifted, not just for him but for both of us. As the evening progressed, Alex's return brought a noticeable change in the atmosphere. Ethan grew more reserved. His usual openness retreating behind the familiar facade he maintained around his brother. Meanwhile, Alex, ever the storyteller, filled the space with tales from work. Blissfully unaware of the tension bubbling just beneath the surface. I observed their interaction with fresh perspective. Alex's confidence and effortless ability to command attention only served to accentuate the unease that seemed to envelop Ethan in his presence. It felt as though Ethan was perpetually gauging himself against Alex, scrutinizing every word and action. Burden hung heavily in the air that evening after Alex had retreated to his room. Ethan and I were left in solitude, the house enveloped in silence, save for the soft murmur of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He perched on the edge of the couch, his body rigid. Eyes locked onto an unseen point in the room. I settled beside him, careful to respect his space. Though he didn't meet my gaze, I could sense the palpable tension emanating from him. Gradually, I extended my hand, resting it gently atop his. This time, he didn't withdraw. Words felt unnecessary, the gravity of the moment spoke volumes. The moment of quiet understanding between us spoke volumes. Ethan had carried the weight of his insecurities for so long, feeling inadequate. While I couldn't solve that for him, I could offer my presence, reminding him in subtle ways that he was seen, and that he mattered. This journey wasn't about Alex anymore, it transcended comparisons and expectations. It was about Ethan discovering himself, stepping out of the shadow he had inhabited for so long. Perhaps it was also about my own journey, learning to navigate alongside him. The intricacies of this connection lingered in the air, hinting at possibilities yet to unfold. The days following that night unfolded like a delicate tapestry. Each moment a gentle brushstroke on a canvas still too intricate to decipher. The house carried an unusual stillness, not heavy or oppressive, but rather a silence filled with unspoken potential. Something lingering just beyond our grasp. Ethan and I found ourselves in a quiet, almost instinctive rhythm. Our eyes would occasionally meet across the room. A brief exchange that conveyed more than words ever could. Our conversation felt like a delicate dance, each of us cautiously exploring the depths of a connection that had unexpectedly flourished. There was a palpable uncertainty about what lay ahead, yet neither of us was ready to sever the bond we had formed. Meanwhile, Alex remained blissfully unaware of the subtle changes around him. Consumed by his late nights and early mornings filled with catering events that kept him perpetually on the move. I could sense that, despite Ethan's efforts to suppress it, the absence of his brother was creating an increasingly undeniable void. Ethan, who had long been content to linger in the shadows, found himself stepping into the light. Caught between two worlds. One where he struggled to meet the expectations set by his older brother, and the other where he endeavored to forge his own path, one step at a time. The contrast between these realms grew more pronounced with each passing day. It was on one of those tranquil evenings, with the rain gently tapping on the windows as autumn fully embraced the season, that Ethan and I once again found ourselves on the couch. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light that danced across the room, yet the air between us felt heavy. In the stillness, we lingered, surrounded by the gentle aroma of chamomile tea. After a stretch of silence, Ethan broke the quiet, his voice unusually soft. Each word laced with hesitation, as if he were weighing the impact of his thoughts. He began to share about Alex, his brother, the one who appeared to have life all mapped out. There was a bitterness in Ethan's tone, yet beneath it lay a deeper current, a quiet sorrow that had been woven into his words, revealing a weight he had carried for far longer than I had understood. He recounted the years he had spent in. Alex's shadow loomed large, casting a pall over Ethan's thoughts. The relentless comparisons gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his perceived inadequacies. He stared into the flickering flames, lost in the weight of it all, the one who seemed to have it all: success, confidence, a clear direction. And then there was him, perpetually lagging. Never quite able to grasp the same heights. The path ahead felt obscured, clouded by the brilliance of another. I could sense the pain in his gaze, the struggle of an unending uphill climb. Though he didn't voice it, the unspoken words hung heavy in the air. The solitude of being the alternative. The one overlooked. His voice trembled as he confessed his uncertainties. It's as if I've dedicated my entire existence to matching his pace, striving to become someone I'm not yet. I find myself lost in the process. It's as though there's a perception of me in the minds of others that I can't escape. The anguish in his words struck me more profoundly than I anticipated. I recognized that Ethan had always appeared withdrawn, but listening to him articulate it, the burden of it was akin to discovering the fissures in a structure that had always appeared unyielding. It wasn't merely about his brother. It was about him, about how he had perceived himself all along, feeling diminished in the brilliance of another's glow. I remained silent initially, allowing the stillness to linger between us. Thick and oppressive. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming steadily against the windows, yet all I could hear was the soft resonance of Ethan's words reverberating in my thoughts. This was no ordinary exchange. It was something profound, something visceral and authentic. Then, as if to shatter the tension, he turned to me, his eyes probing. His expression was almost pleading, revealing a vulnerability I had never seen before. He was exposing himself in a way that felt raw and real, as if the silent barriers he had constructed were beginning to fall away. I could sense the pain beneath, the uncertainty mingled with a desperate need for understanding. Without a second thought, I reached out and touched his hand, offering a small, silent comfort. He flinched initially, hesitant to embrace the emotions swirling between us, but gradually, he relaxed, his fingers curling around mine. The connection crackled with an unspoken promise. A silent agreement that we were united in whatever lay ahead. Then, as if the tension that had been building between us reached a tipping point, he leaned in. His lips grazing mine with the lightest of touches. It wasn't a kiss fueled by passion or urgency, it was something more tender, more subdued, a release. A way to convey all that had been accumulating between us without uttering a single word. When he withdrew, his eyes were wide, almost questioning. As if he were uncertain of what had just transpired or what it meant. Yet there was a flicker of something in his gaze, something softer, more vulnerable. In that moment, I realized this wasn't merely about a kiss, it encompassed everything that had led to it, the pain, the doubts, the yearning for connection. It was a moment of trust. Of surrendering to something neither of us could define, yet both of us desperately needed. I felt no need to speak, no need to offer reassurance. For the kiss had already conveyed what words never could. It was a silent understanding between us, one that transcended the need for articulation. An explanation is needed for the first time in ages. Ethan appeared to release the burden he had borne for so long. As we sat there, the rain pattering outside and the fire softly crackling in the hearth, it felt as if we had crossed an unseen boundary. We were no longer merely two individuals sharing a home, we had become something deeper, something neither of us could fully articulate, yet it was undeniably present. The weather had assumed that crisp, golden essence that autumn often bestows, the kind that invites you to linger. The entire day unfolded outside, a flawless backdrop for a picnic. And I proposed the idea to Ethan, keen to breathe in the fresh air and break free from the house's confines. Ethan had appeared lighter recently, his mood subtly shifting. So I believed a change of scenery would benefit us both. We filled a basket with sandwiches, some fruit, and thermoses of tea, then drove to a nearby park tucked away in the tranquil countryside. The golden leaves of the trees lay scattered on the ground like nature's confetti, while the lake sparkled in the distance, reflecting the pale blue sky as we walked along the trail. A new ease settled between us, no more tension, no more awkwardness. We strolled side by side, and though our words were few, the comfort of simply being together enveloped us. Ethan would occasionally draw my attention to something intriguing, like a particularly large oak tree, or a flock of birds soaring above, his voice light and animated. When we arrived at the perfect spot by the lake, time seemed to slow. We spread out the blanket and we unpacked the food and settled down, enveloped by the gentle hum of nature. Ethan took a deep breath, and I noticed a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he glanced around. For a moment, I couldn't tell if he was smiling at the beauty of the day, or simply relishing the fact that he could be in this peaceful moment without the weight of expectations. We sat in silence, savoring our meal, enjoying the tranquility, and allowing the sun's warmth to bathe us in its glow. Our conversation meandered from the mundane to it was a moment of intimacy as Ethan revealed fragments of his past, sharing stories he had kept hidden. He talked about his childhood, his family, and the ongoing struggle to find his identity. For the first time, he spoke candidly about his relationship with Alex, shedding the layers of defensiveness that usually surrounded him. He acknowledged the difficulty of growing up in his brother's shadow, where Alex appeared to have everything under control, his career, his life, his future, while Ethan felt lost in comparison. He had always felt as though he was in a constant race, striving to keep pace. The more he articulated his thoughts, the clearer it became that his challenges extended beyond merely feeling inferior to Alex. They stemmed from a deeper fear of not fulfilling his own aspirations. I listened intently, nodding in understanding, grasping the gravity of his words more than he might have realized. As he continued, I instinctively reached out, placing my hand gently over his, a spontaneous gesture of comfort. His gaze met mine, revealing a soft, vulnerable expression that crossed his face. An undeniable connection lingering in the air. A silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. I could sense his appreciation for the moment, even if words eluded him. The stillness enveloped us, heavy with unexpressed feelings. Ethan's eyes fell to my hand, still resting atop his, and with a gentle, almost hesitant motion, his fingers found their way to mine. It was a small gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything. As the afternoon slipped away, the fading light stretched shadows across the grass. We gathered our things and began the walk back to the car, but this time, there was a palpable shift between us. There was a shift between us. We were no longer merely two individuals on a casual outing. We had crossed into a realm where we shared something significant. Something deeply personal, a moment of genuine connection that felt irreversible. As we approached the edge of the park, I paused and turned to face him. An electric charge hung in the air. Palpable and undeniable. Ethan stood close, his eyes searching mine, his hands still clasping mine as if he wasn't ready to release his grip. Perhaps neither of us was ready to let go. As I spoke a word, I reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. It was a simple gesture, yet in that moment it felt like everything. Ethan's lips parted slightly. And before I could second-guess myself, he leaned down, his face coming closer to mine. The kiss was soft at first. Tentative, an exploration of a space that had opened between us. His lips pressed gently against mine, and for a moment, everything else faded. There was no past, no future. Just the quiet certainty of the present and the warmth of the connection. We shared a moment, and as we pulled away, my heart raced in my chest, and I noticed Ethan felt the same. We stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just transpired. Words were unnecessary, the kiss had conveyed everything. As we walked back to the car, our hands remained intertwined. And there was no urgency. We both understood this was a beginning, not an end. Whatever lay ahead, we would confront it together. The drive home felt different, the world seemed quieter, softer. As the weight of the day melted away, the space between us felt electric in the most beautiful way. Neither of us spoke much. There was no need. The atmosphere was thick with a silent connection that had blossomed between us. When we returned, we hesitated by the car, reluctant to shatter the moment. Just yet Ethan's gaze found mine, and I noticed a soft smile on his lips, one that lit up his eyes with a fresh spark. We remained there for a few moments, simply gazing at each other, allowing the silence to convey our feelings. Eventually, I reached for the door, prepared to go inside, but Ethan held on. my hand in his one last time. He said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, "Thanks." I nodded, squeezing his hand back. "Anytime." And just like that, I knew that no matter what came next, we had crossed something important together. Our story wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough.